Okay, well, again, today the program is the Parkinson's Journey Parlors program, and we're really excited to keep talking about things that care partners and, of course, people living with Parkinson's can do to improve day to day living. And today we're going to be talking about causes and possible solutions for avoiding situations that involve talking. So when someone's not talking as much or they're trying to get out of certain environments. I'm John Dean. I'm a speech language pathologist, specializing in Parkinson's for about 20 years. I'm joined by the lovely Josefa Domingos, physiotherapist who has also been specializing in Parkinson's. We do a lot of work in this space, and obviously we work quite a bit with the Inova Parkinson's and Movement Disorder Center. We're really glad to be here again. So what we find quite frequently is that people with Parkinson's can often avoid situations that involve talking due to a number of different communication challenges. And it's a pretty wide spectrum. That's why we like to send out our surveys, and we did. And so today we're really going to be talking about communication challenges that people who join us today are experiencing, people who responded to that survey. And then we also got great input, and we're going to share some of the responses about what makes it better or worse, what makes it um, improve based on their own reports. I can tell you what I think as a clinician, but sometimes getting ideas and insights from others is really valuable. And then I will talk about some of the approaches that we might use either online or in person to improve that. So without further ado, let me get into what kinds of communication problems that people are experiencing. And I don't think it's any surprise that the most common problem that people with Parkinson's experience is quiet speech. And this is about a little bit over half of the people who responded to the survey. And quiet speech is so common in Parkinson's that I, as a speech therapist, consider it a hallmark. Come into my clinic and you don't have quiet voicing. I wonder, are you a professional voice user? Or do you have some other kind of strengthening program you've been doing or something? Because it should be there. But it can be a number of other things that could be going on at the same time. It's not just quiet speech, which means we call it hypophonia, which means that maybe the production isn't as effortful, but it could also impact the way that we emphasize different words, the word stress we use, because we're not using as much power. It also ties into pitch changes, the prosody. It's funny, we taught a class today. We do voice, speech, and communication on Tuesdays with the Inova Parkinson's and Movement Disorder Center. And that was one of the things we worked on. We worked on how do you emphasize a word to correct it. Like, no, I mean the dog, or I mean something like that. And so even though voicing is very important and the volume is very important, sometimes changes in that prosody, in that song of speech can actually have a big influence on communication. And then another couple things that you often see when you talk about speech communication is that the movement of the lips and the tongue might not be coordinated as much. Just like you have smaller steps or maybe loss of facial expression, the amount of energy you're using to move your tongue into position to make a T sound, for example, might not be as fast or as complete as before. And as a result, that puts a lot of excess noise, puts a little frication, as we call it, in there. And then the last one there, the harsh voice that I was talking about before, that happens because the vocal folds are not firing consistently. It's an asymmetrical problem in Parkinson's. That's why often you see one arm maybe not swinging, or maybe one step isn't quite as long or full as the other. The vocal folds, the voice box, the vocal cords also have that. And if one of them's not moving completely freely, it will also influence the voicing in that respect. So it's complex. We do tend to treat that voicing, but I do think it's important to consider all the other components, and I usually try to do that either in class or in clinic. Now, this is a question that I think many of you might have been asked before. I wanted to make sure we captured it on our survey. So the question itself is, how often do you experience situations where you think you're communicating normally, but your partner or whoever you're communicating with is reporting difficulties understanding or hearing you? So you think you're talking just as loud as you always have, but your care partner, your spouse, whoever's there needs a hearing aid, or they're not paying attention. There's other reasons. And that's very common. And if you look in the survey, um, only occasionally is a fair amount of people, 42%. But once you start adding in often and very often, that's almost a quarter of people. And that's about right, maybe even a little bit more sometimes. And the reality is, both can be correct. You can certainly have a situation where you may be talking quieter, but it's not uncommon for people with, if you're married to someone for 30 years, that maybe as we get a little older, our hearing's not as good as it used to be, and maybe our vision's not as good as it used to be, and all of a sudden they may not be hearing as well. We call this miscalibration. Do you have something you want to add on there? Yeah. Yeah, but we call this miscalibration, and it usually just means making people aware of how much effort they have to use in order to be heard and understood. It's not unheard of, though, to add in a vision or hearing screening to address that.
I wanted to just share quickly with you that today I had lunch with someone with Parkinson, and his voice was soft because it was the time of the medication that he was taking. And the waiter comes up and he says what he wants, and she says, "I can't hear you!" And she's literally screaming at him. And then he finally says what he wanted, and then she goes away. It's like, she must think I'm deaf or something. So it's this misinterpretation even from who is dealing with it. It's like, how do we transmit that the person is having difficulties without having this type of feedback, right? So just
Yeah.
intriguing situation.
It's not a tip culture over here, so I guess maybe that
Yeah.
I did pretty.
She was so aggressive that I think even we reacted low.
Yeah, that's not good. And again, that person also could have a hearing loss and have trouble with a noisy environment. That is common, though, to have the medications impact the timing of when the speech might be appearing. It can be happening all the time if it's something that you haven't addressed in the past, but often you'll see it cycle with the medications a little bit. So how are we going to address this? How are we going to treat this problem? For sure, I think that speech therapy is your first most important go-to. The treatment that we use for it is very efficacious, and so you'll want to take advantage of that. There's not a lot of things in the world, but this is definitely going to help and make a difference. After that, you'll probably want to do some maintenance exercises when you want to come and do our online voice, speech, and communication classes and dual task for Parkinson's classes where you're using the voice. But there are also, community activities and choirs can be valuable as a way of carrying over. I will say that the research on choirs usually doesn't show much benefits unless there is a speech therapist involved somewhere, but it can be a fun way to get some social engagement and use your voice outside of doing therapy. And then there can be technologies that we implement. A real common one that you may have seen before is something called a speech vibe, which looks like a wearable that you put in your ear, a single AirPod. And basically, when you talk, it puts loud noise in your ear, makes you talk louder. In more extreme situations, that might include a speaker, especially if you're at like a family gathering. But I'd start before you try to do all the experimentation. I'd start by getting a consult with a speech language pathologist that knows something about Parkinson's. Just go to your neurologist and ask them for a referral, and that will have a lot of benefit. And they'll also be able to identify if there's other things that we should be looking at, really the swallowing or something else like that. So kind of looking forward then, the next big area of communication problems, and again, it's very common, is people who are reporting having difficulty maintaining the train of thought or forgetting the word, having the tip of the tongue problem that we know is very common in Parkinson's, or even just keeping up with the pace of the conversation. And sometimes that can be trouble if you're in a big group, or if you're in my family, we kind of talk a lot, we talk pretty fast. It's been a little bit of an adjustment period when Josefa comes over, but it is something that we can work on for sure. When you look at what's happening there, it's important to kind of break down what's happening in the world of communication, because on the one hand, we have all the speech items here on the green side there, the lips and the teeth and the voice and the breath support and the diaphragm. But then you have aspects of speech that are influenced by cognition. And so that's generally around the language production. And when you have a communication with somebody, when you're having a conversation, you're using a lot of components. You're following what they're saying. You're preparing for what you're going to say. Maybe you're drawing from some history that just happened in the conversation, or you're drawing from a history that happened, 10 years ago, and you're adding that into the conversation. Well, back in 94, blah, 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 right? And then you have all these kind of nonverbal pragmatic things, eye contact and nodding your head. It's a lot to do that we typically do automatically. We don't have to think about, okay, it's time for me to nod, or I'll give him a wink, or you're not going to do that. You're going to do it naturally as part of the conversation. But sometimes, or I would say oftentimes in Parkinson's, things that were automatic that you didn't really have to spend time and energy on, maybe you have to spend more time. So how does this all play into this problem that we were just talking about before? Well, when you're trying to come up with the right word, or you're trying to be able to keep your thought process going, a lot of that has to do with attention. It has to do with your ability to stay focused on a conversational partner in spite of a bunch of noise in the background and someone comes up and asking you very rudely what you want for lunch, or things that are happening visually. I think visual noise in the background is another common problem. And so, what happens in those settings is sometimes you get to a situation where, as you're getting distracted, as things are happening around you, maybe you're not responding as quickly. You're kind of, oh, well, what were we talking about? Or maybe you're not using as much volume because as you are being distracted, that's a dual task. Um,
Or even coordinating the moment where you put food in your mouth and then the moment that you're going to talk.
Oh boy, that's a big one. I mean, and sometimes more communication at meal times is not necessarily a better way for safer swallowing. And then there's also kind of more in the PT world and in Josefa's world, walking while talking, getting to a conversation. That's already a bit of a challenge. Someone yesterday was asking me about the stops walking while talking test. But then if you have something that you're carrying or you're managing or you're going over a curve, I mean, there's a lot of components there. It's a big
So
forward.
just a typical prescription of exercises. That make sure you have your daily walking, and then if it becomes boring, take someone with you, have a conversation with someone. But the truth is, it will influence your gait, and it will influence obviously the communication. If I'm turning my head towards the person to speak with them, it's already one challenge. Even if I'm talking forward, the volume is going forward, right? So it sounds easier than it is in the context of Parkinson because you've lost a lot of that automatic movement, and spontaneously being able to keep your posture while you try to maintain a conversation or keep your balance while you're trying to keep a conversation. So this effect on talking and over balance and posture and walking is well known in Parkinson.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting because we have done it for so long. I think we do dual tasking without even thinking about walking and talking almost at birth. And it's like, once it becomes not automatic, you become quickly aware of how much more work it will be. So now how do we address this? What are we going to do? In an environment like this, at a mealtime, at a restaurant or something like that, you want to get rid of distractions. You want to find a quieter a quieter place in the cafe, or maybe you want to go there when you know it's going to be a little quieter, not quite so busy. You want to be getting yourself in a part of the place where maybe you don't have people walking by you. So like a table right by the kitchen or the restroom where people are walking. That visual noise is actually quite a bit of a distraction. And then you also want to make sure that you're addressing factors that are affecting your alertness. So about a lot of attention is just being able to keep focused. But if you have fluctuations in your sleep quality, and then maybe during the day you're getting a little tired, or maybe you have a little what we call like postprandial after a meal, or while you're eating the meal you get a little bit tired. That can influence your ability to stay awake. There's also changes. It's called dysautonomia, but I mean, a fancy term for just being like lower blood pressure, and that can often make you a little bit sleepy and not as attentive, a little lethargic. There are some medications that can get influenced in there, and some of them are for Parkinson's and some other stuff. Um, if you're noticing that relationship, that's a conversation with the doctor. Or, we don't want to boogeyman those things. The meds are very important. But they can be involved. The main thing is tracking patterns and noticing when it's happening. Is it happening at a certain time every day, a certain time in relationship to your medication, after a big heavy meal or something like that? Those are the things you're going to be looking at.
I'm sure this probably comes by instinct, but for the care partners that are here and families, um, I I I do have lots of meals with people with Parkinson, so I tend to think a lot about this. The exact moment that I ask a question, I I have that in mind when I'm having a conversation with someone during a meal. So just coordinating those moments. In this case, the waitress really caught us by surprise. I wasn't expecting that type of raising her voice. But also, so maybe in the future, when I'll ask the person before, what are you thinking of having, so that because she was closer to me, I could have maybe taken that initiative and not make it such a stressful. It was quite stressful and embarrassing, I would say, to have that situation. So maybe we can predict a little bit of those situations and reduce the discomfort.
You hit on something about the stressful and embarrassing part of that because another factor that can exacerbate that word finding issue is being under stress, having to talk publicly or having someone shock you like that, and all of a sudden that stress doesn't help. And sometimes we see it when people come into a clinic. We got to call it white coat syndrome. It's the same thing, and at that point, there's a little bit of preparing or maybe having a strategy, especially with your journey partner, to have a tool for making sure you can get your needs met without having to, deer in the headlights, be on the spot, especially if someone's being rude or unacceptable like that. And also owning your space too. If someone seems like they're impatient with you, that's a good time to kind of spread out, and the time it's going to take is the time it's going to take, and then and don't get stressed about it.
The more I think about the situation, the waiters tend to interrupt conversations all the time. So if people are trying to have a conversation and then they get interrupted, it's as someone that is with the person with Parkinson, maybe just giving a cue word to begin to like, yeah. So what happened there, right? So if the person's telling a story and we are able to, just cue where you were, because you might lose that thought because you were interrupted. So that could also be a way to help.
This must be a conversation for another day about like getting tips or not getting tips. Which I'll do that over here because it's like interrupt me while I'm talking. I don't know. Yeah,
Doesn't happen in the US.
sure it does. I'm sure, but that seemed pretty harsh.
I will stay attentive next time, guys.
Yes. Okay, good. Okay, so now we talked about modifying the environment, and that's pretty important. And that's probably the easiest, quickest thing you can do. But then there's also ways to actually address it by working on the cognitive side of thing. And I'm going to say right now, the evidence for like a targeted exercise, practicing words that begin with the letter K or something like that, it's kind of weak. I mean, it's not that it doesn't help, but it's not the way we use language. And so it's not as functional and practical. And one thing we like to do in our classes is try to kind of replicate the practical things that people do and then make an exercise out of it. So just rote memorization might be a great way to learn a foreign language or to learn your times tables, but it might not be as valuable. And the same thing for some of the brain training apps. There was a lot of promise when those things came out, like Lumosity, but I don't think the research has borne itself out. If I use them at all, and if I use any other kind of puzzles, I use them in a context of voice training, the things like that. Now,
Yeah, so I would say that maybe you might be in the gym and you might have professionals that are adding in the cognition, and they might ask you to say words with a certain letter.
oh, sure.
And in that context where we are trying to maybe help you keep an upright posture or challenging your balance, and adding in that cognitive task it's not weak. It's just it helps us make the physical challenge greater.
Oh, yeah.
And so in that context, it's okay.
Well, I mean, you're actually pointing what we see right here. This is one of the exercises that we commonly do where we have you generating words, but we're also doing movement and trying to get that movement. And then we alternate between exercises like that. That's a completely different, that's great. That actually is a good way to consolidate because the physical component will consolidate it. I guess it's like, like I'm trying to learn Portuguese, just memorizing words over and over again. It's helpful to have that vocabulary, but it's not very practical as far as becoming someone who could communicate. And it's the same thing for addressing that word finding issue. Just memorizing words like that, that's not going to do it. It's better to do it in the context of an exercise like that. It's a great point.
And I would just reinforce, next week we are specifically going to do a program where we will be reflecting about what type of exercise would make sense for cognition. So you are all very welcome to join us. We will be reflecting on what type of exercise would be best for us.
It's a big one for sure. Yeah, it's a big topic. Okay, and this specifically, again, this tip of the tongue problem, this word finding issue is also very common, and it's something that that I think people get really kind of frustrated with. But it's something that's normal and age related, happens to all of us, but it does seem to be a little bit exacerbated in Parkinson's, and maybe particularly if someone's had DDS, it seems to be a little bit more, but just a little bit. And so, again, rather than exercising, I think the thing you might want to try to do is find some ways to work around the issue. If it's not a super important word, okay, I'll come back to it. Leave that placeholder, or see if you can describe around it. Like, we're going to take we all get into that common vehicle. Okay, you mean we're going to take the bus, we're going to take the train, or something like that. If if you're the journey partner, or if your journey partner is really on it, they can maybe help you crowdsource something. Hey, I'm talking about that movie we saw last week. Oh yes, 0 day or whatever. So those are the kind of ways that you can get around it, rather than saying, I'm going to exercise and train my way around it. If I was going to say I was going to exercise my way around it, I'd probably say cardio exercise would probably have or aerobic exercise would have as much influence as training it, which means not as much as you think it would. Better to treat it with techniques and strategies.
I'll have a question for you. It's like usually people will, should we insist, right? So imagine you're not finding the word. To which point would a family member or care come in, right? So I think deciding when to come in, when to help or not, really depends on a good conversation before, no?
I think having that conversation, it's also for when do you want to step in for ordering food, when do you want to assist me, and it could just be like, a little hand gesture, a little kind of eye, you don't need to be too obvious about it, but just a way to communicate, okay, uncle, give me a little bit of help so we can keep moving on, or let it go if it's not that important to remember who was that actor from that movie. And
I think the risk that I see is the person really losing confidence in talking, and this would be a situation where you would avoid talking, because every time you're talking you have someone that's filling in your words. So there has to be a certain balance or negotiation of moments that we should help or not help.
yeah, and I mean, I think you want to be real cautious about that kind of learned helplessness kind of approach. And I'd say that doing it when you can, or what you can, and working through it first. It's not any different than, dividing up household chores and doing the things that you can do, and maybe avoiding things that are less viable. That's the same thing for communication. Okay, so we talked about quiet voicing again, very common. Although if you look at this, all these three around tip of the tongue and maintaining train of thought, is actually a little bit more. Something that's not as common is stuttering or stammering. You might have heard different terminology, and then fast, unintelligible speech. And there's a kind of two different pieces of the same puzzle. So I'm going to break them down one after the other. It's not as common. And so you may never encounter this, but if you notice problems where you're having a hard time getting the word started, or you're finding the pauses are more extended, that be into the fluency area or the stuttering area. It's not the kind of developmental issues that you might have seen in someone who was a kid that was stuttering. If you went to school with somebody and they were someone who stuttered, but if you have a childhood history of it, it does make it a little bit risk factor that it might show up eventually. So again, it's more of the pauses and speed and rate and fluency part of it, and less about starting with the same beginning syllable or beginning letter, or having words or letters that block you in the way that a child would. Again, stress, anxiety, fatigue, those are triggers. And again, working on managing those is not just pharmacological. I mean, that's obviously one part of that, but it's also getting into a comfort zone with your own communication. Now, if someone's putting you in a stressful situation, owning that space. This is great work with a speech therapist to say, no, the time I need to talk is here. I'm going to take that time. This is part of the communication interactions that we have, and you're going to respect it. And I'm going to help you respect it by slowing everything down to my speed, not trying to speed myself and get to your speed. That's not okay. As I mentioned, it could be related to medication cycles and sometimes DBS. And if that's something where you have a stuttering problem that showed up pretty quickly in the last couple of weeks, that's my first question is like, have you changed something in your meds? Has something happened with its programming? Because if that's the case, that might be the thing to talk with the doctor and modify that. Or if not, okay, or had you been having trouble sleeping or other factors? I'm sorry to interrupt you. You could say something.
I was going to say I'm lucky to live in a culture that has, I'd say the people that live with Parkinson in Portugal, because talking slowly And with low voice, he's actually considered elegant. So by teaching people the strategy, they accept it really well. If I talk slower and softer, apparently, people will hear me more.
That's
So
kind of a
culture is very interesting to see the differences.
It's kind of a teacher trick. I don't know if I'm ever going to tell someone to talk quieter, but
Yeah.
you do want to kind of get their attention. But yes, certainly slowing it down. There's nothing wrong with that. Actually, by taking these pauses that I'm taking and slowing it down, it actually makes it a lot easier to follow. You're giving people rest points. They're able to take the information in. And now that I'm demonstrating, let's see if I can keep it going while I talk about fast, unintelligible speech, right? This is a situation that's not too dissimilar. If you ever see older videos of people with Parkinson's where they're stepping and they're walking and the steps get faster and smaller and they have a hard time, there's an analog to that in speech where the communication comes off in really short rushes and it's really fast. And then the more you're talking, the longer you're talking, it gets faster. And that is, it's harder to treat, but it's treatable, but it's not stuttering the way the other stuff is. It's called palilalia or festinating speech. This is called festinating gait, festinating speech. And the speech itself is quieter and it speeds up as they progress. I've got a quick test I always do is, counting from 1 to 10. And if you're going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, things are doing fine. I got no concerns. But if it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's an indication that there's a control. It's a control mechanism. Can be influenced by the medications, more often by peak on and peak off and other triggers. The treatment for it is a little different, and I'll kind of get into it. There are some common things that we would look at, such as recent changes in the meds or recent programming changes. You can try to do the slowing, the prolongation that you were talking about to improve speech that you would use for someone who had a developmental issue, someone who stuttered as a child. Not as good for palilalia, but I try everything. I never say no. But then there are technologies where you can put in audio into your ear using a wearable, basically hearable, that puts your own speech in behind you, a couple hundred milliseconds behind you, that delayed auditory feedback. It's a trick for the nervous system. That's particularly valuable for people with palilalia because you don't have great tools, and this is a nice trick. And if you have that issue, again, work with a speech language pathologist and get a referral. But you have apps that you can test that with. If you want to play with that theory, just look for a delayed auditory feedback app and have a pair of earbuds so that you can hear it.
As I said, when we have freezing of gait,
Yeah.
usually the first strategy we teach people is to stop, right? And reset and never insist. And I was thinking about this. How do we tell people to stop the words? And I wonder if it would be with the breathing. So if you breathe 2 in 2 words or 3 in 3 words.
Okay. Well, you're on to my next tip here. So you're right. It's not so much with the breathing, but what you'll do is you'll use a pacing board. So you have a piece of paper that has several squares on it. I'm just demonstrating with this Post-it, and basically you touch your thing each time, and then after you get good at that, then you say, "I'm going to talk with a couple words each time," and at some point it becomes a lot more fluent, so you don't have to do this, but you'll eventually time it. And then actually, I'll use a clicking kind of pen like this occasionally. I like it better when it has one on the end, and you can do the same thing here. But if you have one on the end, you can actually use it on your thigh and just push down and it goes click, click, click. And again, it's just a self-cueing thing. A big part of that too is you also make sure you're cueing for a nice big breath. So you have a full lung of air and you're not trying to get all the words out before you run out of air. This AAC, this augmentative and alternative communication, those are devices that look a little bit like tablets, like iPads that you press on and they'll say words for you or say phrases. And I've had pretty mixed results. If you want to consider that, I would find someone that has real experience working with AAC to give it a real try. There are a lot of these device manufacturers have representatives that are speech language pathologists that work there. But I have to say, by the time I find someone who needs that, usually the visual changes and the motor changes are significant enough. Maybe some of the changes in thinking are also significant enough that I don't find them to work very well for my needs. but I don't want to talk anyone out of it. One thing I'll say when you start talking about technologies like that, it's a really exciting time in the world of hearing aids. And I know that sounds really nerdy, but the digital signal processing and capacity for providing this really kind of hyper targeted audio signal that cuts out of extraneous noise, that's exciting. And then also a microphone that can be hyper targeted towards what you're trying to listen to, that's exciting. And then the emergence of over-the-counter hearing aids means that a lot of those technologies are coming in at a price point that is probably 20% of what it was 5 years ago. I will say, if you're looking at hearing aids, it behooves you to go to an audiologist to get a hearing assessment. There are places that have over-the-counter hearing aids that will have a dispenser or someone who sells that. Okay. But if you go to an audiologist, we are co-trained. I'm a speech language pathologist. Audiologists have the first year of our program with us, and they are in the same area, and they will do a more comprehensive assessment and also guide you towards what is necessary. There may be times when you have to have a very specific hearing aid. Okay, so be it. That's money. But a lot of times you can get over-the-counter one that does what you need it to do, and they'll help you get tuned to your needs. So that's my sales pitch for my profession. But at the same time, I think if you go to a place that doesn't have an audiologist, you may risk having someone who's in sales mode, and that's not going to be valuable.
I think that's a good tip because sometimes people misplace it so often. So, and because it's so expensive, it's a source of great stress.
Very much so. Actually, I had a friend come visit us here, and she came out of the car, and the first thing her hearing aid came out, and that was the first 20 minutes of our visit with me looking in the sea of cut marble until we found it, and we found it. I think a lot of them now do have little beacons on them, so just like AirPods, you can look for them.
And I will say, by experience the AirPods, I was in a disco last year, and so it was such tremendous noise, which is horrible. And I decided to put my AirPods on, and I thought I wasn't going to hear anything, but it was curious because it helped me have the conversation with the person in front of me. I actually could hear the person in front of me, and with all that noise.
And I mean, that's just blocking out the ambient noise, but there's actually ways to use that even more directly Apple's done some really great stuff. I mean, it's kind of a different conversation, and I probably should not let us get too far afield till we get to all the slides. But yeah. The takeaway here for the person that has about hearing aids, get to an audiologist and have a conversation with them. I just want to go into a couple other topics that are pretty common and pretty important. People often talk about the loss of facial expression. That is what we call facial masking. There are a lot of parts of that, but I would just say at the very high level, that's an analogy. It's a similar part of the loss of the size of your handwriting or the speech volume or the step length. It's just the same thing, but you can see it. It's very visible. It can be also affected by medication cycles. So sometimes maybe when your medications are really on, you might notice it less. And then when you're tapering off, you might notice it getting worse. There are a couple of studies. There's an old one, probably from about 2003, from the team from LSVT, Spielman and et al. And they have a little bit of evidence that exercise may improve it. There's another one from another researcher in 2013 that was also doing LSVT, but the evidence is fairly weak. Those are fairly small studies, and then studies that are actually on actual exercise. You're not doing anything wrong. It may help with mobility of the movement of those structures. If you're doing a class, or especially a kind of singing class, and you're working on that facial stretching, it's not unlike stretching or strengthening in Parkinson's for physical therapy exercises. It's not a net negative, but the evidence that it's going to have a significant influence is not as strong as I would like. And what I often tell people is maybe to consider looking at yourself in the mirror or using a camera in selfie mode and just getting your feel for what you think would improve it. It's often in the eyes. Sometimes you can have a little trick where you can work on your facial expression so that if you know you're about to get into a picture or you're having a conversation, you can bring your game face into that. And then the exercise you do can also benefit that as well.
Mm-hmm. I just also wanted to highlight here that nowadays we are confronted with our image much more than before when we started working many years ago. So every time I would highlight this to someone, which means if I'm video recording and I use it as a tool um, in the clinic, I'm very careful to how I'm going to show the person, right? Because we are facing our own image, and if I can do something about a problem, then it's helpful if I'm raising that issue. But if there are severe limitations in the person being able to do something about it, I would have some caution here because then it might be more cruel. And sometimes we see that from care partners that are highlighting continuously how maybe the person has their mouth slightly open when they're thinking more or when you're more tired. This might happen naturally, associated to those moments where your attention might be less. And so I've had these situations where this was more discomfort for the person that was next to.
Yeah.
In those moments, the person with Parkinson is probably unable to really correct it or do anything about it. So that's why we just place there some caution, just about how useful it is, the things we say.
Yeah, and someone actually in the chat was just saying people are always asking me if I'm mad, and it's like that's frustrating.
Yeah.
Again, this is one of those things where if you are the journey partner, if you're the spouse or the loved one, or even the professional paid care partner of someone there, start to have the conversation that not the easiest thing to say to somebody. It's not the greatest way to approach them. Are you mad? Are you mad? You as a person living with Parkinson to have the agency to tell someone, hey, I'm mad, and you don't have to keep asking me that kind of stuff. But also, again, this is where I think a little bit of training, and again, it's not going to solve it. But if you know you're going to an environment where you're going to encounter someone, maybe it's a unfamiliar communication partner, you're going to the bank, or something like that. I remember this guy who was on camera a lot, and so he could see himself, and he has a little trick with his eyebrow, and he'd get in there, and it's like, if you can soften the eyes, it's just enough to get people to stop asking that question, and that they're trying to be caring for you, but
Chris, I would probably identify maybe all the people, if it's consistently with the same people, that would be my question.
Yeah.
So the people that we are interacting on a daily basis, in making them aware of this issue, I think is important. Because sometimes the family won't know, and so they're trying to understand if you're okay. So I can understand, but so identify or friends or something that usually ask you this question, so that you can just make them aware that this is an issue, and that it's not really helpful if they're always asking it. Or I'll let you know when I'm mad.
Yeah. I will use my words when it's time for me to let you know if I'm unhappy. What makes me mad is asking me that function. I'm taking one step too far. But yes, that's a common thing. And again, take a look in the mirror on the phone and just kind of see what you're putting out there and see if you can do a little stuff. It's usually in the eyes. You can just something like that. And then see if there's anything else you think you need to fix with asymmetry. You can definitely do the exercises, but I don't think I would just do the exercise and say, okay, I've done that. Check that box and it's taken care of. I think you'll want to do a little bit more to really address it. Okay, so then another big one is managing saliva. And again, it's not for everybody that it's a problem, but when it's a problem, it's a problem. And even a real common one is people saying, I'm getting ready to talk and I have too much saliva in my mouth, or I have to clear my throat. And it's like, okay, well, as a speech therapist, I know this seems hyperlogical. I get people in Scots in a habit, like I'm getting ready to talk, okay, upright, breath in, have a swallow. And now I made it 3 separate steps, but you're going to just make that real fluid. Okay, this is my thoughts on this. Quit asking me if I'm mad, like whatever you got to do. So you get in Scots in the habit of that, because what happens with saliva management is that it's one of these things that is normally automatic, that is no longer automatic. And so you have to find a way to make it a habit. You might not make it automatic again, but you can certainly say, okay, I'm getting ready to talk, a posture, breath, swallow, roll. And then for the person who has to clear their throat, same situation. You might swallow hard before clearing my throat and find a way to include that into your routine. One thing I'll say about drooling, that medical term you see a lot of times is sialorrhea, and that rhea term means too much of, so too much saliva. But in reality, what it is in Parkinson's is just you're not managing it. So there's no excess saliva, like a child that has cerebral palsy, there's excess saliva there. It's overproducing. It's a management issue. For you, it's just a matter of making sure that you're addressing it. Now, if that becomes a burden, or it's something that's taking more effort than you want it to, um, talk to your doctor. And I'm a speech therapist, and I'd say for the first 10 years, 12 years, 15 years of me doing this, I would work on drooling. I would work on swallowing. I would get you in Wisconsin a habit where every 2 minutes we're in a session and you hear a little reminder, and eventually I take the reminder away. But I have to say that botulinum toxin, and particularly the FDA approval of Xeomin for drooling and Parkinson's, it's turned my head around a little bit. It's something worth considering because it's an inpatient or an outpatient procedure at the doctor's office, and it's not even an outpatient. It's in their office. You could go in for a visit, and you could report the problem. The doctor could set you up, and they could give you a couple shots of botulinum toxin in the right swallowing glands, and that would actually slow down the drooling enough that it makes it easier to manage, and it lasts for several months, and you can do it repetitively. So talk to your doctor about it, because there might be options that, again, 5, 6, 7 years ago, I may give you a slightly different answer. But as I like to quote from Josefa, I'm not someone that's going to defend my profession. I just wanted to come up with a good solution. And botulinum toxins becoming a lot better than it was when it first came out. Okay, and then others, I'm not going to really get into that kind of stuff. I think the next big part of this that we should be talking about is coming from our surveys, coming from you, what makes things better or worse. And I think um, first, I want to talk a little bit about how symptoms of Parkinson's can influence communication. So I always like to say, whatever you can see in Parkinson's with relation to tremor, more to stiffness or slow movements or small movements, that's going to influence communication, because it's going to influence all the structures of communication: your voice, your lips, your teeth, your tongue, even your air, your breath production. Anything that is going to influence your emotional state. On the one hand, it could just make you more sleepy and less attentive, and that's going to have influences on language. But it's also, if you're highly anxious, that's also going to distract your attention. We talked about sleep dysfunction before. That could be not sleeping well the night before and being fatigued the next day, or it could be daytime sleepiness, which is something that you could address with your doctor. It could be medication related, or there could be a medication for it. Um, Anytime that you are not feeling balanced, and you're feeling unstable, you're now having to direct a cognitive attention to that stability. You have to make yourself more stable. That's why a lot of times in our classes, I get myself in a position that's nice and open, so we don't have to worry about that. And then multitasking. I mean, that's we were talking about that before. It's very common.
So I guess if you recognize the difficulties that you have, and you are someone that perceives that you have balance issues, and that you want to have a conversation with someone, you probably wouldn't choose the standing position. But if you are someone that's dealing maybe with sleepiness during the day, you might want to consider doing it in the standing position. You see, so it's
Yeah,
according to what you are dealing with, you will have to try to find strategies to be able to help you keep the alertness, right? So by standing up, we usually, if we sit down, we're going to fall asleep, right? More probability of sleeping. And so if I'm in an upright position, I'll be able to maintain my attention longer. And in balance, if I sit down, I'll be able to focus on what I'm talking, and my even cognition and communication will improve.
absolutely. Yeah, no, and the takeaway is no one size fits all. Start looking at what the problem is, and then adding a solution. That's really brilliant, Josefa. Okay, these are other things that people were talking a little bit about, and again, medication can have an influence on it, and that could be at the end of a medication cycle. It could also be medications, maybe not for Parkinson's, maybe for something else, that can influence that as well. Or it could be some Parkinson medications at higher doses, and again, that's a doctor thing. So if you're feeling like medication timing seems to be impacting that, go ahead and have a conversation with your doctor about it. One thing I think is the easiest, simplest fix. We kind of already went on a rant about hearing loss and hearing changes for both the person living with Parkinson's and the care partner, or I'm sorry, the journey partner. I love that term. We're going to use it. Is that you can address that with hearing screening and the right technologies. Same thing with vision. Both people living with Parkinson's and the care partner, if you're not able to see me while I'm talking to you, well, that's going to have an impact on the way I process everything. Some of it's going to be the nonverbal, some of it's going to be the way I process your speech. Posture and breath support are under-recognized. There's a really interesting body of animal research, particularly on changes in cognition based on that forward-leaning posture. And similarly, if you don't have enough breath support because of that posture change, that's going to have a huge influence on your ability to communicate, make it more frustrating because you're going to be trying to get the same amount of power out of less air, less support. And then we talked about fatigue, but let's go into fatigue a little bit more. If you are someone who falls asleep when you're sitting down, here's where we really got great information, because I think someone was talking about phone conversations are hard on the voice, and that's a common one. Phone as an audio signal quality already is fairly degraded and compressed in order to make a go over phone line. Same thing in Zoom. And then if it's longer, maybe you're having to really kind of push and talk louder to be heard on those phones. The first thing I would say again is getting back to a speech therapist and strengthening the underlying musculature so you're not using a 9 out of 10 level effort. That's one of the benefits of those kind of LSVT and speak out kind of approaches, is that you get a body of muscle and capacity, and then all of a sudden things become a little more effortless, and that improves your word finding as well as your ability to talk for long times. And then people talking about problems when it's at the end of the medication cycle or when you're tired. Um, Someone saying that DBS surgery has an influence on our communication, and that's not uncommon, but that's something to bring up with the doctor because there are programming changes and ways we can benefit that. But particularly subthalamic nucleus placement (STN), you can have GPI or you can have STN, and the STN is awfully close to a lot of the nerves that end up becoming what control facial muscles. So there are some things that you may be experiencing, and it's worth mentioning to the doctor, see if you can address that with programming. Now, people that say my voice is better in the morning, yeah, I think that's very common. If you wake up and your voice is sore, actually, I start wondering about like reflux or something like that. But generally, earlier on, and as the day goes on, you're using your voice more and more, and you're becoming more tired. And so sometimes maybe you need to find some time to give yourself a break, or you need to do some exercise in order to get your voice back up to speed.
Find ways to get out of a conversation.
Uh, I don't know what that looks like, but yeah,
What?
we'll
You just come back to the beginning. Like, I just wanted to see if you're okay. Okay, I see you okay. So goodbye.
yeah, yeah. No, I'm not mad and elite. No, I'm simply back. Okay. Scenarios and settings that make it worse. Again, certainly noisy environments. And again, a good half of people say only half the time and occasionally, but then often and very often that's making up 4 out of 10 of those. And the first thing is, okay, can you get to the quietest point of that noisy environment? Can you change the time that you go to that noisy environment? Can you leave that noisy environment? And if none of that is the case, can I bring a set of tools to make me better in that noisy environment? I mean, just having your back against the wall so that the sound is bouncing from you and you're not pushing it there, that helps a little bit. Although if you're not hearing yourself well, facing the wall, being in an environment where you have a booth where you're tight on somebody versus a big open table or big long table, those are very hard for anybody. And then again, when you're walking, that's the most common dual task problem is walking and talking. Um, okay, so what approaches are useful? I've mentioned this before. If you haven't worked with a speech language pathology, um, these approaches, particularly for quiet voicing, but for many other aspects of problems with communication and Parkinson's, they are very effective. And LSVT Global in particular has been around for like 40 years almost, so at least 3 decades. And they publish 3 to 4 articles a year, sometimes more. They have great evidence. They have what we call level 1 evidence, randomized, double-blinded, controlled studies. And the Parkinson's Voice Project is an excellent implementation of it. They're just younger, so they don't have that body of evidence. But work with a speech therapist and address this problem directly, and you will get benefits that will be long-lasting and have downstream benefits for many years to come. And you also have a relationship with that speech therapist, so you can come back to them again and again if you need a little touch-up. Self-serving slide, I'm going to qualify that, but I asked, do people do any exercise sessions in communication and who is attending? And it looks like about a third of you, a little bit more than a third of you are going once or twice a week. I hope that means you're coming to our class. A couple folks are doing it daily, which is great. I became a speech therapist because I had a speech problem. I had a voice problem, and I still do those exercises that Dr. Stenfel gave me back in like 1997. I still do them every day because they keep my voice strong. And so a little bit daily exercise is great. And then all of you who said no, like, shame on you, like, no, but you should consider adding it into the mix. Voice exercise is exercise, and you have requirements for doing a certain amount of physical exercise every week. You should add in some communication exercise. And again, self-serving. But we've been teaching this program now in partnership with the Inova Parkinson and Movement Disorder Center for quite a few years now. And it's very fun, it's engaging, and if nothing else, it gives you an opportunity to use your voice in a nice, loud way and also have some social interaction with people. So I would definitely do that. The tips that people come into, this comes from our survey, including stopping and regrouping. That's kind of what you're getting to, Josefa. Pausing, taking a moment to speak more clearly and loudly or speak with intent from the speak out kind of model. Those are all great. And then also, I think, adding exercise in there. So the voice stretch exercises that you may have gotten from your speech therapist. The speech and communication classes that are hosted on Tuesdays at noon Eastern. And then the choir, again, it's a really fun way to do that. And I would only say that don't just do the choir. Make sure you add something else in there just because the research says that. I look at Parkinson in Australia. So we want to open it up for your questions. We got some room for sure. I do want to make sure that I highlight a couple things really quickly as before we get into the questions. Josefa and I, every year we make a point of coming to the Inova Parkinson and Movement Disorders Center. So we're coming in April for an in-person boost camp. A number of you have signed up already. It's going to be a big party. It's always a lot of fun. And it's the stuff we do on camera. We do it live, which is the way we did it initially. Before the COVID times, this is what Josefa and I would do. We would meet in person and we would have fun. And it would always be crazy stuff because she would find some props and stuff to do. It's completely free. Lunch is provided. It's at the Inova Parkinson's and Movement Disorder Center, but it's at their Center for Personalized Health right there in Fairfax. And if you go to Boost Camp on this rebranding link, or you send me an email, or you reach out to Sonia, or you should go on their website. There's a lot of ways to get here. I was just trying to make it easy. This dyskinesia one is very interesting. It's under-recognized. You don't see it enough in the literature, but when you have dyskinesias, which are the movements, the gyrating movements that are associated when your medications are too high and you're at the peak of your medications, it often becomes a reason why someone seeks out DBS or other advanced treatments. It has a lot of influence on your ability to coordinate your breathing, and it makes things sound really tight and kind of spastic. And it's one of these things where we can certainly work on that. If you can't manage the dyskinesias, if it's part of what you're dealing with right now, you can work on some of the breath control side of that. But I would definitely try to get to a doctor to see if they can manage that and give you Dr. Faulkner's always great at talking about the 28 formulations of dopamine replacing and other Parkinson's medications. We have a lot of tools. Get to a doctor that knows how to use those tools and see if you can get to a more steady state flow of your Cinemet or what other medications you're taking so you don't have those dyskinesias. And if anyone says that they're feeling that they're sounding drunk or slurry like that, that's a great reason to work with a speech therapist. It's not LSVT will help that, but we have a different bag of tricks that we're going to use for that. And a lot of it has to do with more intentional speech and rate and pace and pauses. And then also not allowing anyone to be insulting when they accuse you of that. You just hold your ground and you tell them what's up. Um, Another one here, we got this a little bit like earlier before, but if someone is anxious, they start to feeling a little stressed, that might also make them have more, blank mind, word finding issues. And again, I love this for dual tasking. This is why we like to do these kind of exercises. We like to put people under pressure and then give us the response. Oh, and keep moving. Don't stop walking or don't lose the quality of movement. If you do really find yourself in those stressful situations, some of the breathing techniques might be valuable. Again, worth working with a speech therapist. And then communication problems in later stages of Parkinson's and Parkinsonism, that's going to be some of the more difficult to treat, but we do have a bag of tricks for everything. And that's going to be harder to get the overall capacity of breath, So positioning would be really important. Exercises for strengthening your breath using like the expiratory muscle strength trainer can be valuable there. And then I've had a couple people, not for Parkinsonism, and particularly not for MSA, but people with later stage Parkinson's disease, idiopathic Parkinson's, have benefited from trying a little bit of vocal fold augmentation. And that's simply like if you see movie stars making their lips plump or, giving themselves filler, you can do that in your vocal folds and it makes them approximate better and have better function. And it's another thing to consider. So if you're dealing with that, especially in the later stages, build your relationship with your rehab team. Have your physical therapist and your occupational therapist and your speech language pathologist, because we have a bag of tricks, but it's going to be very well custom designed towards your needs. Not going to be you do EMST and you do EMST and whatever, although everyone should do EMST. So, okay, now I've talked enough here.
Yeah. I wanted to add something for the anxiety. Obviously, there's lots of ways that we can try to manage the anxiety. Specifically, when we're talking, I think it's the more positive experiences you have, the more it will boost your confidence. So I think it's really going back to our title today, avoiding is probably going to be the factor that most creates more anxiety, because then every time you put yourself out there, you become anxious because you don't have that memory of what it's like to deal with that stress. So I think I'm in great favor of training resilience to stress and anxiety as one of the ways to capacitate people to be able to deal with it.
And a little bit of building your network too, so you get environments around people that know this and know you. So that support groups, some of the many support groups that the Inova Parkinson's and Mood Disorder Centers funds and underwrites and partners with and supports, even when they're just there to be moral support. They're involved with so many groups that you should be able to find your group. And if you can't, contact Sonia and she'll help you find your people, because they're there for sure.
I think that's one of the most important roles of these community-based programs. I think the advantages is specifically the interaction, the social interaction it promotes. So independently of what you're participating in, as long as we are able to create those friendships and those moments of talking, just that alone is a benefit that you acquire from going.
Yeah, social prescription was a real buzzword a couple of years ago, or last year, really. And I think it has a real place in this. It's really part of the whole overall picture of making sure you're living your best quality of life every day.
And if you see someone really quiet, go there and make some conversation, because they're probably shy to talk.
Don't ask them if they're mad. Yeah, okay, guys.
Those are protected environments, right? So people understand it. So I wouldn't expect it to happen so much there.
Actually, what I like when I get groups is that the stuff that other folks with Parkinson's say to each other is right on the money, and I'm like, oh, that was very direct. Great, that's what they need. That's perfect. So, okay, we're talking too much now, guys. If you have any questions, feel free to send them to me or Sonia, and we'll be happy to give you additional if I talked about something that you want to know more about. And then some of the specific things, we have a whole library as part of our Care Partners program from before. So like the DBS, we have a whole section on voice and DBS. So feel free to look at some of those older ones as well, but we have a lot of them. We have a great library. Thank you for joining us, everyone. Have a good evening.
We hope it was useful.
Thanks. All right, take care.